After the 1929 crash and the bank failures of the Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Banking Act of 1933, known as Glass-Steagall, on June 16, 1933. The law responded to a widespread perception that intertwined banking had taken undue risk with depositors' savings before the crash. Its core move was simple and severe. It separated commercial banking, taking deposits and making loans, from investment banking, underwriting, and dealing in securities. The same law created the FDIC to ensure ordinary deposits and Regulation Q to cap deposit interest. Banks were given 1 year to choose a side, and no more than 10% of a commercial bank's income could come from securities. The danger of unwinding banking rules was demonstrated long before 2008 in the savings and loan crisis. The 1980 Depository Institutions Deregulation Act phased out Regulation Q rate caps and raised deposit insurance to $100,000, and the 1982 Garn-St. Germain Act let thrifts pile into riskier lending. When regulators looked away, insolvent zombie thrifts gambled with insured money, and roughly a third of all S&Ls failed. The cleanup ran under FIRREA in 1989, which created the Resolution Trust Corporation. The RTC alone closed 747 thrifts holding over $407 billion in assets. The crisis ultimately cost taxpayers as much as $124 billion. The lesson: deregulate an insured industry, and the public can eat the losses, went unlearned. Glass-Steagall did not collapse overnight. It was hollowed out from the inside. Because the law only barred affiliation with firms engaged principally in securities, the Federal Reserve reinterpreted it to allow Section 20 subsidiaries, and over a series of steps, the permitted share of revenue from securities was raised to 25% by the late 1990s. The first Section 20 subsidiary was approved in 1987, and by 2000 there were 51 of them nationwide. The wall was already full of holes before anyone voted to tear it down. On April 6, 1998, Travelers Group and Citicorp announced a stock swap merger valuing each at about $70 billion, creating Citigroup with $698 billion in assets, the largest financial firm in the world. The problem was that combining an insurer and securities firm with the biggest commercial bank was not yet legal under Glass-Steagall. The Fed granted a temporary waiver, and as the Fed's own history notes, the deal was made in anticipation of a change in the law then under discussion. In effect, one corporate deal accelerated a legislative push that was already underway. On November 12, 1999, President Bill Clinton signed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, repealing the Glass-Steagall sections that had restricted affiliations between commercial and investment banking since 1933. It created the Financial Holding Company, a single umbrella that could own deposit banking, securities underwriting, and insurance at once, reuniting exactly the activities 1933 had pulled apart. The Senate passed it 90-8. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, who pushed for repeal, joined Citigroup that same year, a revolving door that became the era's symbol. Deregulation did not stop with banking. In May 1998, CFTC Chair Brooksley Born proposed studying oversight of over-the-counter derivatives, and the same day drew a joint statement of grave concerns from Treasury Secretary Rubin, Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, and SEC Chair Arthur Levitt, who pushed Congress to block her. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act, signed December 21, 2000, then explicitly exempted those derivatives, including credit default swaps, from regulation. No central exchange, no transparent pricing, no capital requirements. This was the legal vacuum in which a CDS market that would peak near $62 trillion notional was built. After the dot-com bust, the Fed cut the federal funds rate from about 6.5% to 1% by June 2003 and held it there for a year, making mortgages cheap. Economists still debate how much that policy fueled the bubble. Some argue rates were too low for too long, while others, including Ben Bernanke, point to a global savings glut driving down long-term rates. Either way, the newly consolidated banks chased yield by funding high-risk loans and repackaging them into private label mortgage-backed securities and then into CDOs, an originate-to-distribute model that let lenders offload risk and keep lending. Subprime originations climbed from roughly $120 billion in 2001 to around $625 billion by 2005, about a fifth of the market. Annual global CDO issuance grew from about $150 billion in 2004 to over $500 billion a year by 2006, with the cumulative stock approaching $2 trillion. The machine ran on two enablers. Credit rating agencies, paid by the issuers, stamped true tally on subprime-backed paper, making it saleable to pension funds and money market funds worldwide. More than half of Moody's structured finance securities carried the top grade, and believing risk was hedged away, the big broker-dealers levered up from about 22-1 in 2002 to roughly 30-1 by 2007, with Lehman at 30.7 times. At that leverage, a 3% drop in asset values erases a firm's entire equity. Average U.S. home prices more than doubled between 1998 and 2006, the sharpest rise on record. Home prices peaked at the start of 2007 on the FFJFA index, and the exits closed. Borrowers could no longer refinance or sell their way out, loss rates climbed, and on April 2nd, 2007, New Century Financial, the nation's second-largest subprime lender, filed for bankruptcy and fired 3,200 workers. Then the ratings reversed en masse. In 2007, Moody's downgraded 83% of the $869 billion in mortgage securities it had rated AAA the year before. The supposedly safe paper was suddenly unsellable. On August 9, 2007, French bank BNP Paribas froze redemptions on 3 funds, declaring that the complete evaporation of liquidity in parts of the U.S. securitization market made it impossible to value certain assets. That single statement signaled the AAA model was unpriceable. Banks stopped trusting each other, the asset-backed commercial paper market seized, and the same day the European Central Bank injected 94.8 billion euros and the Fed added $24 billion to hold rates near target. On August 17th, the Fed cut its discount rate to 5.75%, its first formal response to the crisis. By December 2007, the economy was in recession. In March 2008, the investment bank Bear Stearns failed and was absorbed by JP Morgan, with the Fed backstopping about $30 billion of its illiquid assets, showing a single interconnected dealer could threaten the whole system. Then came the climax. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac entered conservatorship on September 7th. Lehman Brothers filed the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history on September 15th. And on September 16th, the Fed extended an $85 billion loan to AIG, which had written credit default swaps on more than $500 billion of assets it could not cover. The same day AIG fell, the Reserve Primary Fund broke the buck because it held Lehman debt, triggering a run that pulled over $400 billion from money funds and froze the commercial paper market companies used to make payroll. That was the precise jump from Wall Street to Main Street. The TED spread, a gauge of bank distrust, spiked to a record 457 basis points on October 10th. Congress passed the $700 billion TARP bailout on October 3rd. The Fed drove rates to near zero and launched quantitative easing, and the Great Recession ran 18 months. GDP fell 4.3%, unemployment hit 10%, household net worth dropped from about $69 to $55 trillion, and more than 12 million homes went into foreclosure. In January 2011, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission's majority concluded the crisis was avoidable, blaming more than 30 years of deregulation that left a 21st century financial system with 19th century safeguards. That majority verdict was not unanimous. The commission split along political lines, with one group of dissenters faulting global factors and another blaming federal housing policy. Congress answered with the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, whose Volcker rule partially rebuilt the 1933 wall by barring insured banks from proprietary trading, and even Sandy Weill, the man who built Citigroup, called in 2012 for breaking the big banks back up. Honesty requires a caveat. Many economists note the firms that actually failed, like Lehman and Bear, were standalone investment banks not created by the repeal, and the commercial banks that failed did so from subprime lending Glass-Steagall always permitted. So the deeper cause was the whole deregulatory mindset, securitization, dark derivatives, and leverage, more than the 1999 statute alone. The arc still closes the same way. 1933 built the wall, the decades after tore pieces down, and 2008 sent the bill. The one protection that never failed across the S&L crisis in 2008 is FDIC deposit insurance. Born in that same 1933 law and now covering $250,000 per depositor, per insured bank, per ownership category. Since 1934, cash within those limits at an insured bank was never lost. The repeated pattern is that complexity hides risk, whether zombie thrifts, Che-A-rated subprime, or opaque swaps, and the belief that some asset always goes up tends to precede a collapse. The takeaway from this history is durable, diversification, emergency cash inside insured limits, and caution about heavy leverage on a single appreciating asset are the themes that recur, though none of this is personal financial advice.